Well, hi, everyone. First of all, it's very exciting to see so many people in our panel because I think we all agree that this is like a very important subject, and I'm happy that you agree as well. My name is Uli. Reika did the most hard job here, which is to present everyone by their full name. So that's saved me my biggest headache. But I'm here. I wrote, I guess the reason I'm moderating it is because I wrote part with a joint team with Facebook, part of the GraphQL spec. It's a more technical subject, but I have another talk later today about it. But instead of me talking about it, there's much more distinguished guests here, and I think the best way is just to let them talk about themselves and introduce themselves. So Gregory, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, okay, thank you. So I'm Gregory, I'm heading the developer relations team within TomTom. And I can already see a lot of people wondering, is that the same TomTom I know from these navigation devices that were out there like a few years ago, and no worries, they are still out there, but of course we see that a lot of people start to navigate with their mobile phones. And the answer is yes, so TomTom is doing a lot of things. One of them is, of course, still selling the personal navigation devices. But we are still also very active in the B2B space. That means that we are also providing our map data, our traffic data to large enterprises out there. And not a lot of people know that because it's not always TomTom branded, but it's being used in the background. So to prove that, perhaps let me ask you a question. So who is using TomTom Maps today? And I see a few hands, you know, and that's not really representative because we know that, let's say, on a daily basis, there's about 1 billion people using TomTom Maps. So if I would ask the question in a completely different way, I'm sure I will get more response. So who in the audience is using Apple Maps or Uber today? You see, so that proved my point. So there's a lot of TomTom technology like map data, traffic data, which is used in these applications that people don't always know because it's, like I said, not always TomTom branded. So that's also the reason why we decided to, let's say, open up our APIs, because we have a lot of cool technology like routing. People can calculate travel times with our technology. They can find places. They can geocode addresses, but not a lot of people know that. So we have also a lot of APIs, and that's of course also the reason why we're here to talk a bit about why we have started with these APIs, how we made them successful. So yeah, I think that's it a bit about TomTom. So to introduce myself a bit, so I started at TomTom in 2010. And I was mainly active as somebody who is supporting customers from a pre-sales and a post-sales perspective. So that means that I was joining account managers. So I have a technical background because I was a developer during the first few years of my career. But then I started always to have some roles which required some technical and some commercial skills. So in that aspect, I started TomTom as pre- and post-sales engineer. And I worked with a lot of interesting companies like Apple, Microsoft, Uber to understand how our products work so that they can integrate them well. But also once we signed the contract to make sure that they kept on innovating based on the products that we were offering. And then about 2 years ago, I got the opportunity to become the head of the developer relations team. And for TomTom, I think in 2016, we made a very important strategic decision that yeah, we of course had to make up for the decline for the P&D, the consumer devices that we were seeing. So we had to innovate. We invested a lot in new technology, and one of the important innovations that we brought out there was the APIs. So like I said, we have APIs for doing search, for displaying maps, for displaying traffic data, for calculating travel times. And it's actually really exciting to build something up from the ground. So that also meant that we, of course, had to initiate a lot of technical people who were supporting the development for these APIs, but also a developer relations team, which was responsible for talking to the developers, understanding what developers liked, but more importantly, what they didn't like about the APIs that we had, so that we could improve and make sure that we had a product which was actually yeah, liked by developers and by the B2B companies who are out there. Yeah, since then my role is mainly to support developers, but also to advocate our APIs to developers, meaning that we were doing a lot of conferences, meetups, hackathons, because it's important that also people internally within TomTom know what developers are thinking about our APIs. So we're actually a bit the bridge between the internal product units who are creating and developing our APIs and of course the developers who are using the APIs. And that is very important that you, yeah, because those are the people that you create the products for, right? The developers out there. So yeah, that's it a bit for my introduction. So I'm sure there might be other questions, but we'll talk about some of the aspects a bit more later in this panel.
Yeah, thanks, Gregory. Jason, introduce yourself.
I'm Jason Harmon from Typeform. Typeform, we sort of help companies get to know their customers better through conversational forums. So while forums, in some sense, to a lot of developers go, oh, whatever, I can do forums, I think we provide that at scale and with a variety of kind of logic and interesting features that help route the logical flow through those forms. And more importantly for us is that what we've kind of learned over time is that personas like marketers and product folks, they need that human interaction to start an automated process of activity behind it. So for us, we look that we're typically more of a system of engagement, and then we help get the data into the systems of record where it needs to happen. So in the fall, we launched our developer portal and a whole new range of APIs, which are the same APIs that are being used in the UX of the product. So it's all kind of a microservice architecture behind the scenes. So we're kind of in a transition as a company of taking the investments we've made in microservices, starting to share that with the world through our public APIs, and continuing to expand those, and kind of work with companies like Autopilot and Cloudflare in building kind of partnerships around these integrated experiences that ultimately help sort of marketers, product folks, and frankly a whole wide variety of other personas really complete what they're trying to accomplish with the human touch at the beginning. So when it comes to sort of automated marketing campaigns or whatever, we're really the ones that touch people directly. In terms of kind of gathering their feedback, their input, getting in touch with people, that sort of thing. So Typeform, we're a pretty young company, 3 or 4 years really kind of out in the wild. I think out of the panel here, we're certainly the smallest ones, probably about 200 people. So we're kind of coming up quick, learning a lot, and a lot of this kind of developer stuff is relatively new to the company. From my background, I've worked at PayPal and Braintree before this, helped build the developer program at UShip, which is a shipping marketplace. Basically, I come from a kind of developer or a back-end engineering background. So API design is kind of really, how I've built the last 5-10 years of my career is that process. So a big part of what I also help with on the engineering side is making sure that our API process around building microservices is something that we're thinking of as productizable or externalizable from the beginning. So that's kind of an area I'm really passionate about, making sure that we have testing and processes around the API development lifecycle that ensure that we ultimately have kind of a reliable experience externally. And as an organization, we're still learning a lot, but that's certainly where I think my passion lies, somewhere between API design and kind of developer community and building that community around what we're doing. So I'll pass it on to JoseLuis. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm JoseLuis Takahashi from Line Corporation. Before I talk about what my company is, how many of you actually know about Line? Can you raise your hands? Oh, okay. So just to talk about my company, what we're doing. Well, Line Corporation is actually a messenger application in Japan, one of the biggest ones, and we have like 200 million active users, monthly active users. So that's quite big, and our market is basically on Southeast Asia. So Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia, Thailand are our major markets. So what I'm doing in Line Corporation, I'm a product manager for developer products. So I talk with developers and enterprises about what APIs we should be starting to use and how we should use it and how we can start using it. So our company has really become bigger and bigger. We have started using a lot of users, like we have bot APIs, we have social login APIs. We also have started to use IoT, also APIs, and we're starting also blockchain. So we're quite doing a lot of stuff, and I think this this talk here about APIs is really interesting to me to talk about. So going on about myself, introducing myself. So I've been doing a lot of, developer side, starting from network engineering, layer 1 to layer 3, you know, those old kind of stuff, to server side also. So I was actually doing server side installations and also Java developer, installing Java for enterprises, and also a support manager for enterprises. This is another kind of things I've been doing. And I also been doing game. I was in the game company doing SDKs like Unity, also Adobe Air, and creating these SDKs for them. And so I've been doing a lot of stuff. So my passion is actually for developers, creating new products for them, making their lives easy. And this is why I joined Line, because it was starting to open their platform for APIs. And I really wanted to work with them to open these APIs to all the developers and use this API for their services. So Line is actually a more B2B2C type of way of businesses we do. So all the APIs here we use, we provided are B2B2C, and I think in the future we will provide even more APIs openly and work on it, and we will talk about a little bit more about APIs later. So this is my introduction, so let's go on.
Hi everybody, I'm Piers Clough. I head up innovation platforms for Visa in Europe. So I'll explain a little bit about what they are. So number one is I'm responsible in Europe for Visa Developer, which is our open API platform, developer.visa.com. We launched that in February 2016 at Mobile World Congress. And I think the point around that is Visa's been in existence for 50 years. It has 16,000 financial institutions connected to us, 3.2 billion Visa cards out in the world, 46 million merchant acceptance locations, and all of that was historically built on a closed proprietary network that we ran and controlled. And if you wanted to access it, we dug up the road and we put a box in your data center. That's kind of the model that's served us well, and it's not going anywhere, by the way, either, because this is what delivers the reliability that we have. However, in a world where we can see 3.2 billion cards turning into 20 billion connected payment-enabled devices, and 44 billion potential acceptance locations and devices, we need to open up that network, right? Having fixed dedicated lines is not going to scale. Opening up our APIs, again, securely, but effectively opening that out not only to our traditional clients, whether they're financial institutions or merchants, but the developer community, new fintechs entering the market. That's something that we care very passionately about, and so that's the whole reason for Visa Developer. The second piece of what I'm responsible for is how do we take things through the life cycle of development. The traditional approach I've seen prior to Visa, I worked in UK government, were big, scary IT transformation projects that always cost too much. They always took too long, and they never delivered quite what anybody wanted. The world has evolved. And I think one of the things that we work with our clients on and ourselves is how do we disrupt our own ways of working. It's very easy for us to develop a coded prototype using our APIs. Finding the path to production, the path to scale in the marketplace, the path to testing and learning is actually where we need to be more creative. It's easy if you're a startup to put something into the market because you've got no legacy. Now, you've got different challenges. What we're finding is a lot of our clients really struggle with how do they test and learn new propositions in the marketplace. The people that are doing really well do this as second nature. So one of the things that we're building out is the ability to take things through alpha and beta pilot so you can actually start to test this stuff out in the marketplace, pivot as required. So that's really what I'm responsible for, and delighted to be here with you.
Thank you very much, all. I think for me, it's very interesting that we are all kind of have like a programmer developer background, But what's more interesting for me is that we have 4 very different types of businesses here. And for me, for example, when I'm talking to clients or talking to companies, the first hurdle and the most meaningful one sometimes is why? What are APIs and why should the business start doing those? So it's very interesting for me to hear from you what was the journey inside your own company and how do you make APIs inside the company being meaningful to the business itself. So maybe Jason, you can start.
Sure. Yeah, I think Typeform was like a lot of startups early on. Developers threw together an API, we had it out there, and it does the job that it was asked to do, not in a very performant way, not in always the most reliable way. This kind of microservices transformation started from the engineering side, but I think really set up kind of a ramp for us to start thinking about what does all this stuff mean to our business. From another angle, we also looked at, we had an integration with Zapier that was set up very early on, and to be honest, I don't think we really paid that much attention to it. So when I came on, that was kind of one of the first things I checked into, and we realized like we're one of the top apps in the Zapier ecosystem, highly connected to all these things. And I think it was great because it gave us a stronger indication that like this is a platform that, as I say, it kind of wants to be connected. Like it makes sense that it connects to all these other things, and really helped us understand a little bit better what are the kinds of integrations people are typically using. So in kind of getting these APIs launched, it definitely kind of went the last year of making that happen, and now kind of seeing it start to operate is, we can look at API metrics, and it's interesting, right? How many people are using this API versus this one? But on some level, you really have to understand your kind of core unit of value. And when you're in, say for Visa, right, transactions coming from my background at PayPal, it's a very easy business model to understand, right? If you have a transaction, there's a piece of it you get, and you know exactly how to measure it. I think when you're in kind of other kinds of apps where it's a little harder to figure out, it really forced us to ask some questions. Is it building the form that's the valuable piece? Well, no, not really. Like, you can build the form and that's fine, but ultimately getting responses from people about what are you trying to learn? And granted, from there it gets more nuanced. What kind of questions are you asking? What's the ultimate answer you're looking for? But ultimately, when we look at what value is someone getting from operating with us, it's really about storing that response. And so it really kind of informed a lot when we look back at kind of the metrics on KPIs and how we're measuring these things as to what we should really look at. And it's really, I think over the last year or two, started to kind of shape how we plan to change pricing and all this kind of stuff in the future. So those are all insights we wouldn't have had if we hadn't kind of dug into what it means to be integrated. And I think in some ways, like, there's a tendency to look and see APIs there and go, oh, well, that's the thing that makes it all work. But it's really just a tool, right? I mean, GraphQL, for example, is just another tool. REST is another tool. SOAP's been around forever. Whatever it is, it's a tool to get things connected. But if you don't have the business narrative around it, not only for yourself, but for who it is that you're connecting with, and you don't share a way to grow value together, then the tool doesn't matter that much.
How do, for example, like in your company, for example, how do you make sure that you get this business value even though your team is probably most of developers, like in there, Gregory?
Yeah, so well, I think the business value is something that that always comes later. If I look at how we originally started off with our APIs, it was more like we saw that there was some request in the market to get access, for example, to calculating travel times or to easily get access to map data or to display that in an application. So there was some engineering initiative, and we said like, okay, now we have these REST APIs. Great, we should offer them via a portal. So we started building a portal. And then our account managers, our salespeople, they went out there and said, hey, you know what? We have these great APIs. Perhaps you should try it out. And what we saw over the years is that, yeah, of course, it's great to have fantastic technology and something that people want, but it requires much more if you really want to monetize it and include a business model in it. So first thing, for example, that we had to do is make sure that people had a very easy way to get access to our products and to our APIs. So we made sure that people could just register online, that they could click, for example, which APIs they wanted to get access to, and they immediately got an API key. that took about, let's say, to create an API key and to register takes like 1 minute. While in the past, if I look at how things went, like say 3-4 years ago, people had to sign a paper evaluation agreement that they could test our APIs. Then that paper agreement was sent to legal, which we all know is not the fastest department. So then legal had to process it, had to send it to the engineering team, and then the engineering team provided access to those APIs. So of course, that's not really developer friendly, right? So you need to make sure that your products are, first of all, really good accessible. And on top of that, what we also noticed is once we got those products really accessible, that you also need to make sure that you have a good business model for the large enterprises that you want to sell your APIs to, but also for the startups, the smaller companies. So that's why we started launching last year some kind of an online business model where people have access to our pricing, where they can just go online and pay with their credit card, with Visa, MasterCard, whatever. So we made sure that people who wanted to use our APIs, they got very easily access to that, and that they can even very easily monetize and start using them commercially. And that was really important to make sure that we could scale and that we could handle, let's say, that large developer community out there. And that we didn't only focus on a specific market segment. So initially we also didn't thought, for example, about developer personas, because it's also important if you create an API that you start thinking, hey, to whom am I really creating these APIs for, and what should it mean for those people? And that started off, let's say, after a couple of months, years, that we started thinking about it and that we started to refine our strategy. But yeah, like I said, the journey that we took from creating our first API and then launching that to the market and where we are now, I mean, yeah, there's like 3 or 4 years that passed by.
And in a company like Line, for example, was the process the same? Like people just came in, build this API, and then figure out why do you do it, or it was the other way around? Or?
So for Line, actually, it was completely a way around. Like the product, the planners actually started creating, saying, "Oh, I want to do this, I want to do that," but they had no idea how to do it through APIs. So our developers actually started to get those ideas and started creating the APIs for it. But meaning that the planners, when they created these APIs, are mostly closed. Like, only for specific scenarios, not for everyone to use or the usage. So it was at the beginning, before I even joined Line, it was quite closed. But after I joined, we started to make the APIs more easier to use, because Line is a messenger application. And we really wanted to have our developers communicate with the users. And I think our APIs are based for that to use. And we started to begin to start opening our platform for these APIs. And this is how we started creating more platform APIs, more open to developers, and to use our ecosystem, which is to communicate with the users. This API is quite powerful. So we have bots, we have like social graph. And I think this is how we started, but now we're starting more from developer side point of view, how we should make these APIs. So it's more like the scenarios from developers to know how to use it, and providing this information to the planners, how they should use it, is a completely different way as we are working in Line right now.
How would you, so I always struggle when I talk to a company, is like, first, like we talked about like the business value of the APIs, but who are you aiming for when you build your API platform? Like there's developers, there's business owners, there's many people involved, and who are you usually aiming to?
So we're normally aiming to, right now, developers. Of course, our business owners are also a priority, but we mainly focus on developers because this is a more easier strategy to allow developers create their services, and that business owners can find those use cases from developers to actually implement to their services and actually expand their services. So making it open will provide more use cases for our business owners.
How is it at Visa?
So I like the point you made about the personas. I think that's really important. So, number one, yes, for the developer community, and that's whether it's within banks, merchants, fintechs, startups, it has to be, geared towards making that an easy-to-use experience. That's one that we're constantly refining in terms of the UI and the UX of the experience, how we're building out the community pages, the GitHub repository, the how-to videos, all of that good stuff. And I think where we started to tweak that was publishing a list of APIs. If I said we had 100 APIs, if I said we had 101, is that one better or not? I mean, that's the wrong statement. It's like, what do they do? How do they help me solve a problem? And how do you navigate the vast array of people that may come to our developer site to go and find the thing that they want to use as quickly as possible? So that's the view we take from a developer perspective. I think the other key persona that we think about is the product owner. So do we describe what these things do in plain language? Like, can we express the use cases that we've enabled using these APIs? So we think about, traveling. Can I use my card when I go abroad? Can I get the FX rate of my currency to the local currency? Can I enable my bank to know that I'm in a foreign country so that when I do that transaction, their fraud engine goes, oh, okay, the mobile phone is in the same place as the card. That's a user journey that that we see and we can relate to. So we define that user journey with our partners, and then the last point is which are the APIs that enable it. So you can come at the content from two directions. I think the final one, and I'm not, as we think about this, is the business owner piece, which is, is this going to get me there faster? Is it going to get me there cheaper? Right? Because fundamentally, we have to demonstrate that the value of our APIs is use these to build your product. Right? It's not about us delivering that as an end consumer product because we're a B2B2C organization. Right? It's our clients that are building that consumer product. We just need to demonstrate that, using this is going to get you there faster. It's going to enable you to concentrate on delivering the best customer experience you possibly can. Why would you build this service when you can go and get it from somewhere else? I mean, I love the example of, I now know that TomTom is plugged in to all of these services. Why would you go and build that if actually there's someone in the marketplace that's delivering it better? And most importantly, it's got to be easy to use, right?
Yeah, I think I find in this business model of API, it's kind of like there's the part which I think is very important that you emphasize is like we need to explain to the business people what exactly they get, what are the metrics, then there's the other part of the developer side, which is kind of like an approach where you say, here are our APIs, let's wait for the magic to happen in a way. Let's see what they come up with something like new use cases that we didn't thought before. Like, did you have some stories or cases where it happened for you in your business?
I mean, just a really simple one, right? We publish the FX rates as an API. It's probably the easiest to use API. It's the easiest to get into production with. And, we're just, the amount of different use cases we've seen people put into the market with that's what we've been surprised by. Yes, show me the FX rate combined with geolocation when I arrive in a foreign country. Okay, but we've used it, it's been used in back-end reconciliation for treasury departments. So that we've been continually surprised in something that seems so simple that how people have gone and taken that. The next evolution is how people will mash up our APIs with third-party APIs. That's where we start to see real excitement. And again, we're stage one of this, right?
How about Line?
So for Line, we had a lot of interesting things going on. But the most interesting we had was the bot itself. They was using it as a noble game. We didn't thought about that, and that bot had a lot of users. And they also use their own way to gain revenue, doing ads on it, like part of the Nobel, like talking about which select A, B, C, which went to go, and they put a little bit of ads in there, but it's not that annoying. So we said, oh, this is like a different way to use our APIs, and this was quite fun when we saw it. There were also other things that we saw was a game. They actually put a chess game in the bot. It's like you go up and down in the chat room, but they just put a chess like dot and press it and go and play the games. So they had a lot of ways how the bot was used, and it was quite fun looking at those. And this is one way that the business side found that it's a useful case.
That's really cool. So let's say now we went through the point of convincing and we're inside the business, and I think the next phase is like, sometimes the question is how hard it is to expose an API, and what is the investment that's been required, and who is using it later? Does it benefit like our internal development or just our external development? Can you share maybe a bit about this process and how technically you got into solving those?
I mean, I think in Typeform's case, this is a pretty easy story. We, beginning of the company, typical kind of mono or, single application running the whole thing. And so obviously, as we started trying to break that out into separate services, breaking out the UI from the back end, all that kind of stuff, we're naturally, as I heard, drinking our own champagne because we don't make dog food. That process kind of really forced us to make sure that like you can do anything you can do in the product through the APIs. You can build up the whole form, get the responses. I mean, whatever you can see in general, you can do from the APIs. And I think having some channel for that, at UShip, I was a place at before, we were building mobile apps on the APIs and then sort of selectively dog-earing those along the process, that these are going to make sense externally. You've got to have a way for whoever kind of at Typeform, we tend to see a lot more kind of back-end developers, tend to see more server developers, so getting front-end developers in our case to help give input is good, but then we also have to always balance that against the kind of server-side developers that we see externally. So ultimately, like, your first developer community is always inside the company. If you can set up structurally a way to make that happen, then you've got a leg up on learning the differences of how it'll be externally.
How is it in your case? How do you make the developer users happy?
Yeah, so we have a bit of a similar approach. So in TomTom, we also have, of course, the consumer division that I talked about, who is creating products for end consumers. And what we see is that the APIs that they are using are exactly the same APIs as the ones that we're licensing. So we're not having different APIs for the products that are being developed internally than the ones that are externally being put out there. So I think it's very important because if you launch a specific product, then you can already get feedback from the audience that you intended towards externally, but you get that from people internally, then it's always great as a first step to make sure that you can perhaps even fine-tune it a bit more before you actually launch it externally. So I think it's a great test audience. And if I look at the challenges to expose your APIs externally, there's of course much more that you need to think about, because you need to make sure that you have a good API management system, because you want to make sure that customers only have access to the products that they are licensed to or that they should get access to. You need to make sure that you have certain SLAs, so you need to make sure that you get response times, that you have your availability. So all that comes into play, of course, when you start opening up your APIs to external customers. And that is, of course, something that, in a lot of cases, people don't think about in the beginning. But if you start talking to companies, to larger companies, they will always have these kind of requirements, and they will come to you like, hey, what is your default SLA? How much availability can you guarantee us? And then you need to start thinking like, hey, are we approaching this in the right way? Do we need to make sure that we approach it a bit more professionally? Also, do we need to make sure that we deploy our services not only in Europe, but for example, also in APAC and in the US to make sure that you have great response time? So I think along the way, you learn a lot of things if you're opening your APIs to developers that you didn't really necessarily thought it in the beginning when you were starting with it. But I think it's needed if you want to really be into the game with the big players and who are already offering APIs as well and who are out there. So that's really important that you make sure that you think about it from the beginning. How can I really make sure that these APIs are professional, and what kind of uptime guarantees do we want to provide to customers? What is competitive? So know what competition is doing and make sure that you have a good offer to that.
I think what we've learned is that we need to run at different speeds across our organization. So for a core platform that processes 65,000 transactions per second, the non-functional requirements around that are pretty gold-plated for very good reason. So organizationally, that's a bias that we have. That's where the point of arrival for anything that's delivering at scale needs to get to. You don't design, you don't implement at that scale day one. So I think what we've learned is you've got to deliver the experience, you've got to deliver the functionality, the ease of use. You've got to have a nice API architecture. You've got to get those things right day one. But how do you then go and scale that and deliver at different speeds? And I think the biggest thing that we've learned is, we're updating the UI UX of our developer site, weekly, if not daily. We're tweaking that. We're pushing new functionality and uplift to the APIs themselves on a monthly basis, which for us is, that we're used to doing sort of 2 major releases per year, giving everybody lots of notice because, that's how we've worked. So it's really being able to, you talked about breaking out the applications. This is almost like breaking out our organizational structure to go, do you know what, we need to operate at different speeds.
Yep.
So that's been the key learning.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a few more minutes, but it's interesting for me. Like, we are in the executive channel, but then I see that the main questions from people are completely technical, which I would love to answer. But if I would kind of summarize, maybe put the GraphQL question aside, because for that you should join my talk maybe in 2 hours. But what are, maybe if we'll wrap all those questions together, what are the technical things and technical considerations you want people to know before starting, or where they are right now that you can share?
Oh, this versioning question comes up all over the place, right? And I think what's important to recognize is that kind of strategically, it would be great if you could never version. And that would be the best message you can push is, let's not, right? Because it's a pain all the way around for everyone involved. But always have a backup plan. In other words, don't go out the door with no way to version and no plan on how you're going to do it, because it's going to come back and get you eventually. The business changes, it evolves. Client needs change, they evolve. I think it depends on what market you're into. But beyond that, I would say that beyond the technical stuff, it's make sure that you're using language that represents your customer language and not your internal language, and be careful of marketing language, because that's not going to stick around always. So I'd say those are kind of 2 basic principles that, from a kind of design and thought process of how you get the ball rolling, are super critical.
Yeah, Line had the same issue, as you mentioned, that, versioning is really bad. We had just that because we needed to migrate to a new version, and the architecture was like versioning. So it was quite not easy for developers or business owners to actually migrate it. So as you said, versioning is not really a good thing to do. It will be best that all API endpoints will be the same, but have access token. Maybe the access token will be versioning, and have, even though they call the same API, they can respond the same different kind of JSON from the REST APIs. So it can improve the ability for the users and developers to not need to migrate, and more easier way. And that's what we learned very hard from my last experience. So just to inform, we just had the same experiences.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but the versioning question is kind of I have to comment on that, because in GraphQL is kind of one of the main premises, you don't need to version your APIs, you basically keep the same APIs, but the idea there, I think, came mostly from philosophy, which I think the philosophy of not versioning, and that you can operate with whatever technology you do, as less versioning as possible in Facebook, since they have APIs that are still live since 2012. They basically just everything, because they have mobile versions, running in some ways that it still didn't happen. And the way they do that, just technically, is just track all the calls. And there's a team of 5 people now, actually, since 2 days ago, 4 people in Facebook, that they're the only ones who can actually delete an API. And they just track the usage, and if the usage is not close to 0, they just won't remove any, they won't deprecate anything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a legacy that you carry for quite some time, right? If you start with versioning and creating APIs which are not backward compatible, I think also our philosophy and our principle for designing new APIs is make sure that they're always backwards compatible, that you don't create new versions, because it's easy for you to create a new version, but it's not easy for your customers and your developers to make sure that all the end user devices, all the end user applications are being updated and are compliant with your new version. So if you create a new version, it means that you need to give developers and customers out there the time to migrate from one version to another. So you cannot say, hey, I'm going to stop with this version and I'm going to introduce this new version from one day to the other. That's something which is unacceptable and that developers will also not accept. So yeah, I think it's always good that you start thinking about, if you really need to do it, what will be your migration strategy? Will you give developers like 1 year notice up front, make sure that they're all informed, that they have the time to adapt? And then there are still individual cases for developers that will not be able to migrate for some reason. So I think you will carry a lot of legacy if you don't stick to that design principle. And yeah, from a company cost point of view and effort point of view, it's definitely not, I think, the right approach to introduce a lot of versioning. So avoid it if you can.
So we need to wrap up so you can go to eat. What are like one short message from each of you that is the one or few key things you want people in the audience to know? Starting, we'll go from the fur to from you to here.
I mean, I think the one thing, is let's build it together. So I think the most, the value of working in this way is, why try to build everything by yourself? The value of APIs is they make it so much easier, if we get it right, to be able to go and get the right capabilities from the right providers, to then go and focus on the thing you really want to do, which is go and deliver an awesome customer experience. That's...
Okay, for me, it's like, actually, the community is one of the most you need to have for APIs, because they are the ones telling you what you actually need to have, what kind of APIs you need to create. So it's always, you need to think about what the other users, the customers want, and hear their feedbacks, what they want. And I think this is the best way to create APIs in the future, and more easier ways to do it.
I think, kind of backtracking a bit on a topic earlier on, how do you address both business and developers? I think, to me, you always have to keep in mind that developers try and business buys, and that's kind of, you're always projecting in two voices, because yeah, developers will come up with serendipitous, interesting things that frankly aren't always the most commercially viable. They're interesting, they're informative, they're directional, but at the end of the day, it's really those bigger relationships that you get where you need the business narrative around it to actually have a commercial opportunity. And I think for a lot of developers building APIs, that's completely lost on them. And when it comes to documenting APIs, recognizing that you start every description of everything you do with something that anybody can understand before you dig into the technical. And that takes a few failures to learn that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, if you want to be successful as a company with your API strategy, is that you need to think developer-centric, and that can seem very obvious. And of course, developers will think developer-centric, but there's a lot of other people in a company that you need to make the APIs a success. For example, you need marketing, although developers hate marketing, but believe me, there is a good way to market your APIs to developers also. But also the marketing people need to think developer-centric. So that's really important. You have product marketing people, you have the product managers in the organization, you have the management in the organization. And sometimes if your company does not come from an API-centric organization, I think it's hard to make that shift, because it's a mind shift that people need to make. But I think it's one of the hardest things to achieve. But if you get there, it's really satisfying to see that people start thinking in a way which is good for developers, and that they appreciate that developer program which is being out there.
Yeah, so thank you very much all for a very, at least for me, very fascinating panel. Yeah, and if you want to get more technical, 2 hours later I also talk, but then it's much more technical. But I think I'll try to demonstrate maybe some of the points you gave here. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.